into custody Nick Reiner, a suspect in this case. He was subsequently booked for murder.
It started like so many Hollywood nightmares do. A quiet house in Brentwood, a door that doesn't open, a routine appointment that suddenly feels wrong. And then the headline hit like a punch. Filmmaker Rob Reiner and his wife, Michele Reiner, found dead inside their home. But here's what makes this story different. Because almost immediately, the public didn't just want answers, they wanted a villain. Within hours, the case turned into something bigger than a tragedy, bigger than grief, a frenzy where every pause, every missing detail, every delayed update became proof of something darker. And then the internet did what it always does when it smells blood in the water. It started naming the wrong people. Tonight, we're going to do something most videos won't do. We're going to separate three things cleanly, carefully, and without guessing. What's confirmed, what's alleged in the investigation so far, and what's pure rumor dressed up like leaks. Because one tiny detail from that day, one detail most people repeat incorrectly, changed the entire narrative. It's the moment Romy Reiner arrived at the house. And the question is simple, but it rewrites everything. Who actually made the emergency call? That answer matters because it's the first domino. And once it falls, you start seeing how a family tragedy became a viral machine, and how one sibling's name got dragged into the fire without evidence, without charges, and without mercy. Now we need to reconstruct the verified timeline step by step, right up to the moment first responders arrived, because the earliest version of the story sent the internet running in one direction, while the confirmed facts point somewhere else entirely. By the time the story reached your feed, it already looked finished. A clean headline, a polished narrative, careful wording that felt almost too careful. But real cases don't move like movies. They move in fragments, timestamps, dispatch notes, court filings, and the kind of silence that makes people fill in blanks with whatever scares them most. Here's what can be laid out from confirmed reporting and official statements, without turning tragedy into fan fiction. It was Sunday, December 14th, 2025, in Brentwood, Los Angeles. Sometime that afternoon, Romy Reiner arrived at her parents' home. And this is where the internet got the first detail wrong, because it wasn't Romy who picked up the phone and calmly reported anything. According to reporting based on official documents, Romy discovered her father first. The shock was immediate, the kind that shuts your body down before your brain can even catch up. She fled the home because staying inside wasn't an option. The emergency call was placed by someone with her, reported as her roommate, at approximately 3:38 p.m. That timestamp matters because it's the first hard anchor in a sea of rumors. First responders moved fast, and the paperwork that followed is brutally specific. Rob Reiner was recorded as discovered at 3:45 p.m. Then, 1 minute later, 3:46 p.m., Michele Reiner was recorded as discovered. Two timestamps, 60 seconds apart, that turned a family's worst day into a case file. That same day, authorities later arrested their son, Nick Reiner, in connection with the deaths. 2 days later, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office announced charges. 2 counts of first-degree murder with additional allegations tied to the case. And then, right when the public expected more answers, something happened that poured gasoline on this speculation. A court order led to medical examiner records being sealed, limiting what could be publicly released while detectives worked the case. Officially, It was described as protecting the integrity of the investigation. Unofficially, it created the perfect vacuum for the internet to do what it does best: invent. That's when a story stopped being what happened and became who can we blame. And that's where Jake Reiner's name started getting dragged into a narrative that, so far, has not matched the official charging decision. Because in cases like this, the loudest theory is rarely the truest one. Before we go any further, we have to do something that the internet refused to do in the first 24 hours. We have to get the names right, because this story didn't just become a homicide investigation. It became a keyword hunt. Rob Reiner, Michele Singer Reiner. And then the children suddenly turned into search terms: Nick, Jake, Rummy. 3 names that sound clean on a screen, but behind them is a family that just shattered. Rob and Michele had 3 kids: Nick, Jake, and Romy, plus Rob's adopted daughter, Tracy, from his first marriage. And the reason that matters is simple. Only one of those names is tied to the charges. Nick Reiner is the one prosecutors charged, not Jake, not Romy. That's not someone's opinion. That's the official direction of the case. But the online machine doesn't care about official direction. It cares about traction. And traction loves one word more than any other: exposed. That word makes you feel like you're about to learn something forbidden. It makes you feel like you're ahead of the crowd, like you're about to pull back a curtain that powerful people try to nail shut. Except sometimes there isn't a curtain. Sometimes there is just grief. And when grief meets silence, people don't wait for facts. They manufacture them. Here's what happened next. After the initial reports, the public started demanding details that investigators weren't ready or legally able to release. And then came the court order. The medical examiner records related to the investigation were put under a security hold after a court order initiated by police. That meant information that had been publicly available was suddenly pulled back. No new records, no added details, no documents posted, nothing. Now, to a careful person, that reads like the investigation is active. But to the internet, that reads like they're hiding something. And that assumption, right there, was the oxygen. Because the moment the record goes quiet, rumor gets loud. So channels began stitching together insider claims, anonymous sources, and dramatic language that felt cinematic but wasn't verifiable. And in that fog, Jake's name started appearing in titles. Not because any public filing accused him, not because prosecutors pointed to him, but because a certain kind of content thrives on the idea that the story must be bigger than what the documents say. It's a cruel truth. When a tragedy involves a famous name, the public doesn't just want closure, they want a plot twist. And Jake became an easy target for that twist. A brother is a perfect character in the internet's favorite genre, the family betrayal story. It doesn't matter that Jake and Romy later released a statement pleading for compassion and privacy, asking for speculation to be tempered, asking for their parents to be remembered for the love they gave. Even that kind of a statement, written from raw pain, gets treated like a clue. People start analyzing punctuation, the order of words, the absence of certain names. And what gets lost is the most obvious thing of all. They weren't writing a mystery novel. They were trying to breathe. Now, I need to be very clear here. If you've seen claims floating around online that Jake was linked by forensic evidence, or that insiders confirmed something explosive, understand this. In a case this public, with this level of scrutiny, real developments do not live only in whispery screenshots and faceless sources. They show up in filings, they show up in official statements, they show up in credible reporting tied to named documents. And so far, based on what's publicly documented, the charged suspect is Nick. That doesn't answer every question, it doesn't explain the pain, it doesn't give you the why, but it does tell you what's real and what's been inflated for clicks. And if you're wondering why I'm spending time on this, why I'm not rushing into the most sensational version, it's because this is where the real story actually begins. Not in a Hollywood conspiracy, in something far uglier and far more human. A family that, by multiple accounts, had been trying for years to help someone they loved, while quietly living with a fear they didn't know how to name. And the next step is the hardest step, because it's where the timeline stops being about headlines and starts being about the life that led to this moment. The rehabs, the relapses, the moments of stability that fooled everyone into thinking things were finally better. And one detail from Nick's past, documented, reported, and repeatedly overlooked, changes how you understand what this family may have been fighting behind closed doors. Here's the moment the story stopped being just a breaking news alert and became an obsession. Because once Romy's arrival at the house became public, two things happened at the exact same time. First, the confirmed details started forming a real timeline. And second, the internet started building a second timeline, one made of assumptions. The confirmed version is painfully simple. A massage therapist arrived for a scheduled appointment and couldn't get an answer. Romy came over with someone close to her. She went in first, and what she saw broke her in a way words can't polish. And the detail people kept repeating wrong, the one that kept getting twisted into something ugly, was the emergency call. Romy didn't place it. Someone with her did. Not because it was a scheme, not because it was a cover, because shock doesn't look neat. Shock looks like a body that stops cooperating. And while the internet argued about that one detail like it was a clue in a murder mystery, prosecutors moved in a direction that was very clear. 2 days later, the Los Angeles County District Attorney announced charges against their son, Nick Reiner, 2 counts of murder with a special circumstance allegation involving multiple murders and an allegation that a knife was used. The DA's words were blunt, and they cut through the noise with something rare in true crime coverage: restraint. Prosecuting cases involving family violence are heart-wrenching, the district attorney said. That sentence matters because it tells you how law enforcement is framing this, not as a conspiracy thriller, not as a Hollywood scandal, but as a brutal, intimate crime inside a family. And then the silence started. The medical examiner information, details people normally expect to see, was suddenly placed under a security hold after a court order initiated by police, blocking release of additional records, and even pulling back information that had already been public. To the public, that felt like a cover-up, but in an active homicide case, a lock on information can mean something far more ordinary and far more legal. Investigators are protecting evidence, protecting a timeline, protecting what they all need in court. Still, that kind of silence does something to people. When the facts don't arrive fast enough, speculation rushes in to fill the gap. And that's when the story is split into 2 worlds. In the real world, a defendant is charged. The legal process begins. Evidence is handled quietly. In the internet world, every sealed document becomes proof that something bigger is being hidden. Every family member becomes a suspect in somebody's comments section. And that's exactly how Jake's name got pulled into headlines. Because when people are starving for an explanation, they don't always choose the true one. They choose the most dramatic one. But here's where the story gets darker in a way that doesn't need rumors. Because reporting shows this wasn't a family that suddenly collapsed overnight. There were warning signs, there were past calls for help, there was a long struggle that, from the outside, looked like a famous family going through something private, until it wasn't private anymore. Years before the killings, police had responded to welfare and mental health-related calls at the home. And later, reporting described Nick's past struggles with addiction, including periods of instability that the family had tried again and again to manage. That's the part people skip when they want a clean villain. They want a single motive, a single gotcha moment. But families like this don't break in one scene. They break in chapters. And the next chapter is the one that feels almost unbearable because it forces you to look at the long road that led here. The public history of addiction, the attempts at recovery, the way love can turn into vigilance, and how a family can spend years trying to keep someone alive only to end up as the headline they feared most. Here's the uncomfortable truth the internet keeps trying to replace with something flashier. This didn't need a secret society. It didn't need powerful forces. It didn't need a Hollywood cover-up. What it needed was time. Because when a family lives for years with addiction and severe mental illness in the same house as love, money, and fame, the danger doesn't always announce itself like a scream. Sometimes it creeps in like a routine, a door that stays locked a little more often, a voice that sounds a little less steady, a mood swing that gets explained away because everyone wants to believe the last treatment finally worked. And then one day, the private struggle becomes a public crime scene. Multiple reports have described Nick Reiner as having a long history of addiction, with repeated attempts at treatment, periods of relapse, and mental health struggles that were serious enough to shape the entire rhythm of the household. Not tabloid serious, real serious. The kind of serious where help becomes a full-time job, where parents stop living in the present and start living in prevention. And here's a detail that hits differently once you know it. Years before this tragedy, police records show officers had responded to the Reiner's home for welfare and mental health-related calls. That doesn't prove a crime, but it proves a pattern. A family wasn't ignoring anything. They were calling for help. And if you've ever watched a family go through this, you already know the cruel paradox. The more you love someone struggling, the more you end up living inside fear. Fear of what they'll do to themselves, fear of what they'll do to someone else, fear of what happens when you finally fall asleep. Now add one more layer. Nick wasn't a stranger to telling his story. He and his father worked on a film together, Being Charlie, about addiction and the chaos around it. Think about what that means for a second. A father and son put a version of that pain on the screen, while the real thing was still burning at home. That isn't Hollywood manipulation. That's an attempt, desperate, creative, human, to reach someone in a language they might actually hear. And it makes the case feel even more brutal because it suggests something heartbreaking. They didn't just try one thing, they tried many, and still the ending came. This is where the online narrative gets especially dangerous because people love to turn addiction into a moral story. Bad son, good parents, or worse. They enabled him, so they caused it. But real life doesn't work like that. Families don't choose this. They adapt to it. They learn how to smile in public while monitoring everything in private. They learn how to celebrate birthdays while quietly checking whether someone is sober. They learn how to make calls they're ashamed of making, because if they don't make them, nobody will. And then, when something horrific happens, strangers demand a clean explanation. A motive you can summarize in a sentence. A villain you can point at without trembling. That's why Jake got pulled into this. Not because the documents pointed at him, because the internet needed a second villain when the first one felt too complicated. Because addiction plus mental illness plus family violence is not a satisfying story for people who watch tragedy like entertainment. It's too real. It's too close. It forces you to imagine your own family in that house. And here's the part almost nobody says out loud. When the medical examiner records were sealed under court order, it didn't just protect the investigation. It protected the public from the most graphic details. But it also did something else, something nobody wanted. It made the imagination louder than the facts. And in that imagination, every family member becomes a suspect. Every silence becomes guilt. Every grief statement becomes PR. Except they weren't doing PR. They were trying not to drown. And there's one last detail, reported, real, and chilling, because it suggests this wasn't just a sudden snap. It suggests the last 24 hours before the killings may have included a moment so volatile that people who witnessed it still can't agree on how serious it was. A moment that, if true, makes the timeline feel even more haunting. This is the point where every dramatic voice on the internet tries to take over the story. They'll tell you the ending is already written. They'll tell you they know what happened. They'll pick a villain, circle a name, and speak in absolutes, because certainty sells. But the real world doesn't run on clickbait. In the real world, the only thing that matters now is what can be proven in court. Nick Reiner has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, with the special circumstance of multiple murders. Prosecutors have said the case could carry the maximum penalty of life without parole or the death penalty, though the district attorney also said no decision had been made about pursuing the death penalty at that point. Authorities have also said a knife was used, while details about the weapon and evidence are expected to be addressed through the legal process, not the rumor mill. And right here, this is where it becomes important to say something out loud that gets lost in viral storytelling. A charge is not a conviction. A courtroom is where truth is tested, not where it's performed. That means the loudest internet theory doesn't win. The most cinematic headline doesn't win. Evidence wins, or it doesn't. And while that slow machine begins to turn, another kind of consequence is already happening in real time. The surviving family members are living in a world where grief isn't private anymore, because even after prosecutors named the accused, some channels kept dragging Jake Reiner into titles, using that familiar language of exposed, leaked, secret DNA, and insider sources. But so far, the public record has been clear about who is facing charges. So what does that mean for Jake and Romy? It means they became collateral damage in a story they didn't choose, forced to watch strangers treat their parents' deaths like entertainment, and treat their own last name like a puzzle, And it means their statement, calling their parents their best friends, describing their grief as constant, wasn't a clue. It was a lifeline. Now remember the open loop we left hanging, the volatile moment in the final stretch before everything collapsed. Multiple reports described a very loud argument involving Rob and Nick at a party the night before. And you don't have to turn that into a conspiracy to understand how chilling that is. Because if you've ever been near a situation like this, you know the terrifying part. Sometimes the warning signs don't look like a monster. Sometimes they look like something handled, something the family thinks they can manage one more time. And that's where Rob Reiner's legacy becomes painfully complicated, because his public life was built on the stories about humanity, love, friendship, loyalty, redemption, the kind of films people rewatch when they want to believe the world still makes sense. But this ending, this real-life ending, forces a question Hollywood hates. What happens when love isn't enough to save someone? What happens when money isn't enough to buy safety? And what happens when the system can't or won't hold a person long enough to keep them from destroying themselves or someone else? If the reporting is true that Nick struggled for years with addiction and severe mental illness, then this tragedy isn't just about a single day in December. It's about years of trying, years of fear, years of hoping that the next rehab, the next medication, the next calm stretch would finally be the one that lasts. And now, as the world waits for court dates and sealed records and official timelines, the most haunting part is this. Rob Reiner spent a career telling stories where people find each other again, where the door opens, where someone comes home. But in this story, the door didn't open. It closed, and the only people left standing outside are the ones who have to carry the name, while the internet tries to rewrite what it thinks it knows. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Soft but impossible to forget. When a family spends years fighting to save one person, how do they survive the day that fight finally loses?